The corner of Main and Elm in Riverdale, 1947. The bell above the door at Miller's grocery chimes as Mrs. Abernathy pushes it open, stepping onto creaking wooden floors that have borne the weight of 3 generations. Mr. Miller looks up from behind the counter where he's been since 5 a.m., the sleeves of his white shirt rolled past his elbows, a pencil tucked behind his ear. "Morning, Eleanor," he calls, already reaching for her usual order: flour, sugar, and the special blend of coffee he grinds fresh every Tuesday. This is the story of America's neighborhood grocery stores, once the beating hearts of communities across the nation, and their gradual disappearance from the American landscape. What happened to these pillars of American neighborhoods? How did the places where shopkeepers knew your children's names and extended credit during hard times transform into sprawling fluorescent-lit warehouses where we scan our own groceries without speaking to a soul? Miller's was one of nearly 350,000 independent grocery stores that dotted America's landscape in the 1940s. By 2020, that number had dwindled to fewer than 21,000. Their stories are written in faded signage, repurposed buildings, and the memories of elderly customers who still remember when buying food meant conversation, community, and connection. The neighborhood grocery wasn't just a place of commerce. It was where news traveled, where political opinions formed, where romances blossomed over produce selections, and where immigrants took their first steps toward the American dream. The corner grocery was democracy and capitalism at its most intimate scale, a space where daily economic exchange happened face-to-face between neighbors. In certain abandoned storefronts, former shop owners speak of hearing phantom cash registers in the night. Security guards in converted grocery buildings report unexplainable cold spots near old meat counters. Perhaps these are just stories, or perhaps something of the social energy of these spaces remains imprinted on their walls. What is certain is that something profound has been lost in America's food landscape: a way of shopping, a way of connecting, and a way of life. On Porter Street in Chicago's West Side, Yancey Jackson began each day at 4:30 a.m., lifting the metal security gate of Jackson's family grocery. The son of a Mississippi sharecropper who'd come north during the Great Migration, Yancey had saved for 10 years while working at the Armour meatpacking plant before putting a down payment on the store in 1952. The investment, $12,400, his entire life savings and loans from 6 relatives. A neighborhood needs 3 things, Yancey often told his son: a church to feed the soul, a school to feed the mind, and a grocery to feed the body. For 37 years, Jackson's grocery filled that third role for 8 square blocks of predominantly black residents who often faced discrimination at downtown markets. The origins of America's neighborhood grocery stores can be traced to the earliest days of colonization. The general store, selling everything from nails to sugar, evolved over centuries into more specialized food retailers. But the modern neighborhood grocery, as we know it, emerged in the late 19th century as urbanization concentrated populations and new preservation technologies made year-round food retail viable. In 1879, the first commercial refrigeration systems made it possible for neighborhood stores to stock perishables consistently. By 1895, there were an estimated 100,000 grocery stores in America, most occupying the ground floors of residential buildings in densely populated urban areas. In San Francisco, census records show one grocery store for approximately every 150 residents in 1900, an almost unimaginable density by modern standards. These early grocers were largely immigrants, German, Italian, Jewish, Irish, who found in small retail an accessible path to entrepreneurship. Starting a grocery required relatively little capital, approximately $500 in 1900, equivalent to about $15,000 today, and no formal education. A willingness to work 16-hour days, extend credit to reliable customers, and maintain meticulous inventory was the foundation of success. On Manhattan's Lower East Side, Dahlia Oppenheimer arrived from Bavaria in 1886 with $18 sewn into the lining of her coat. By 1890, she was operating a small dairy store, selling milk, cheese, and eggs to fellow immigrants. By 1905, her shop had expanded to a full grocery, employing 4 neighborhood women and supporting her 5 children through college. Her ledgers, preserved in the New York Historical Society, reveal the invisible financial web that held communities together, detailed records of credit extended and paid, often over years. The early neighborhood grocery stores were cramped spaces of intense sensory experience. barrels of pickles fermented near open bags of flour, cheeses aged on counters. Coffee beans were ground to order, filling the shop with aroma. Scales clanked as shop owners weighed bulk goods. The air was thick with the smell of spices, smoked meats, and produce that had often been harvested just hours before. These spaces were not simply transactional, they were profoundly social. Studies of urban communities in the 1920s found that the average housewife spent between 45 minutes and 2 hours daily at local markets, not just shopping, but exchanging information about everything from childrearing to politics. In Chicago's Bronzeville, Atlanta's Sweet Auburn, and Harlem's vibrant streets, Black-owned grocery stores served as informal community centers where discussions of civil rights and economic empowerment happened alongside commerce. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, it was these neighborhood grocers, who often kept communities fed through informal credit systems that large chain stores couldn't match. The architectural footprint of the neighborhood grocery was as distinctive as its social function. Typically occupying 801,200 square feet, these stores featured large display windows, often with the proprietor's name hand-painted in gold leaf. Inside, wooden floors were worn to a patina by decades of foot traffic. Goods climbed to the ceiling on shelves accessed by rolling ladders. The owner's living quarters were frequently located directly above or behind the shop, the ultimate in short commutes. In Portland, Oregon, the 1912 building that housed Martinelli's Grocery on Belmont Street still stands, though it's now a craft brewery. In the basement, workers occasionally report hearing the sounds of crates being moved when no one is there. Some say it's the spirit of Old Man Martinelli, who worked until his death at 92, still rotating stock in the afterlife. Whether such stories reflect supernatural reality or simply our collective nostalgia, they speak to something profound. These spaces meant something beyond commerce. They were extensions of home, of family, of community identity itself. The golden age of the neighborhood grocery store in America stretched roughly from 1920 to 1960. During this period, these establishments weren't merely surviving. They were thriving institutions central to daily life and community identity. A typical day at Rosenberg's Grocery in Baltimore's Patterson Park neighborhood in 1950 began at 6 a.m. when Abraham Rosenberg accepted deliveries from local dairies and bakeries. By 7, his wife Sarah had arranged the produce display, carefully polishing apples to a shine and arranging them in pyramids. Their son Daniel managed the small meat counter at the back, while daughter Ruth operated the register. Customers arrived in predictable waves: laborers before their shifts, mothers after dropping children at school, elderly residents in mid-morning when the shop was quietest. Each was greeted by name. Their preferences were known without asking. When Mrs. Kowalski came in for her weekly shop, Abraham already had set aside the cuts of meat her husband preferred. When widower Mr. Ginelli stopped by, Sarah would often have an extra portion of soup she'd, accidentally, made too much of at home. The economics of these stores operated on remarkably thin margins. Historical business records from neighborhood groceries in the 1940s show typical profit margins of 1.525%, sustained only by volume, low overhead, and family labor that often went uncompensated in any formal sense. The Rosenberg family, like many grocers, lived in 3 rooms behind their store, eliminating both housing costs and commuting time. The neighborhood grocery excelled at a business model that large competitors couldn't match. Personalization, flexibility, and social capital. When the Morty family faced unemployment during a factory layoff in 1954, their tab at Rosenberg's grew to over $200, approximately $2,000 in today's money. They paid it back slowly over 2 years once work resumed. No credit check was performed, no interest was charged. The transaction was recorded in a simple ledger, based on Abraham's assessment that the Mortys are good people who hit a rough patch. This form of informal community banking sustained neighborhoods through economic hardships. A study of Baltimore neighborhoods during the 1958 recession found that areas with high concentrations of independent grocers weathered economic downturns better than those serviced primarily by chain stores, which required immediate payment and offered no personalized credit. The physical layout of these stores reflected their hybrid nature as both commercial and social spaces. Unlike later supermarkets designed to maximize traffic flow and impulse purchases, neighborhood groceries were arranged to facilitate conversation. The checkout counter was not a terminal point, but a social hub where customers could linger. Seating, often just a couple of chairs near the stove or radiator, provided space for elderly residents to rest and socialize. These stores served functions far beyond food distribution. They were message centers in an era before widespread telephone access, with bulletin boards advertising rooms for rent, jobs available, and items for sale. They were informal banks, extending credit when formal institutions wouldn't. They were cultural preservation societies, stocking specialty foods that connected immigrants to their homelands, and they were information networks, spreading news faster than any newspaper. In Spanish Harlem, bodega owner Eduardo Reyes described his role in a 1956 oral history. "I know who is sick, who needs work, which boys are getting in trouble. The priest comes to me to know which families need help. The politicians come before elections. I hear everything, I see everything. Sometimes I am like a doctor or lawyer, giving advice when people have nowhere else to go." This period saw neighborhood grocers adapt to significant technological change. Refrigeration transformed inventory management. By 1940, 56% of American households own refrigerators, changing shopping patterns from daily to weekly visits. Grocers who invested in commercial refrigeration expanded meat and dairy offerings. Those who couldn't found themselves increasingly unable to compete, yet the social importance of these spaces often overshadowed their economic function. When radio ownership became widespread in the 1930s, many grocers installed sets in their stores, drawing customers who couldn't afford their own. During World War II, neighborhood groceries became de facto rationing administrators, often bending official rules to ensure that families with special circumstances, a returning wounded veteran, a new baby, received extra sugar or butter despite rationing limitations. The trust embedded in these relationships extended in both directions. Shoplifting was remarkably rare in neighborhood groceries compared to larger stores. When it did occur, it was often handled as a social rather than criminal matter. In a documented case from 1946, when a 12-year-old boy was caught stealing candy from Kleinman's grocery in Detroit, Mr. Kleinman's response was to offer him a job sweeping up after school, addressing the child's desire for sweets and lack of pocket money simultaneously. The owners of neighborhood groceries occupied a complex social position, simultaneously business owners, aligned with capital, and community members, aligned with labor. During labor disputes that rocked industrial America, they often straddled uncomfortable middle ground. When steel workers struck in Pittsburgh in 1959, local grocers extended credit to strikers while maintaining relationships with management families, serving as one of the few neutral grounds where different social classes continued to interact. This period wasn't without significant problems, however. Racial discrimination meant Black Americans were systematically denied bank loans for business ownership. In northern cities, many white grocers exploited captive markets in segregated neighborhoods, charging higher prices for lower quality goods. The rise of Black-owned groceries in the 1940s and 50s was thus not merely economic, but political, acts of community self-determination. The peak of the neighborhood grocery era came in the immediate post-war period. In 1948, there were approximately 350,000 independent grocery stores, serving a population of 146 million Americans, roughly one store for every 400 people. These stores captured approximately 92% of all food retail spending, with chain supermarkets representing a small but growing segment of the market. 5 years later, cracks were beginning to show in this seemingly solid institution, yet few observers could have predicted the scale and speed of the transformation about to unfold. The neighborhood grocery seemed as permanent a feature of American life as the church or school, but forces were already in motion that would fundamentally reshape how Americans bought food, and by extension, how they related to their communities. Some former grocery stores, now converted to other uses, report unusual phenomena. In Chicago, a bookstore that occupies a former Italian grocery is known for books inexplicably rearranging themselves overnight. In New Orleans, a bar in a former corner store reports bottles occasionally moving from shelves to the counter, as if an invisible shopkeeper is still serving customers. Are these just stories? Perhaps. But they speak to a deeper truth. These spaces held such intense social energy that it's hard to imagine it simply dissipating. What happened to America's neighborhood groceries wasn't the result of a single factor, but rather the convergence of multiple forces, technological, economic, demographic, and cultural, that transformed the country in the decades following World War II. The turning point came earlier than many realize. June 26, 1936, the date when the Piggly Wiggly Corporation opened its first self-service grocery store in Memphis, Tennessee. While earlier experiments with self-service had occurred, this marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in American food retail. No longer would shoppers give their lists to clerks who gathered items. Instead, customers would walk the aisles themselves, selecting goods from shelves, a model that would become the template for modern supermarkets. The economics were compelling. Self-service reduced labor costs dramatically. A traditional neighborhood grocery needed one employee for approximately every 8-10 customers. The new supermarket model required just one employee per 50-60 customers. This allowed for lower prices while maintaining profitability, creating a competitive advantage that would prove devastating to traditional grocers. World War II temporarily paused this transition as rationing systems favored smaller, local retailers who could manage community distribution. But the post-war period saw three accelerating trends that would prove fatal to the neighborhood grocery model: suburbanization, automobile ownership, and television. Between 1945 and 1960, approximately 13 million Americans moved from cities to newly constructed suburbs. This demographic shift fundamentally altered shopping patterns. Suburban development prioritized the automobile, not the pedestrian. Zoning laws in many new communities specifically prohibited mixed-use development that had allowed groceries to operate in residential neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Administration, created in 1934, accelerated this trend by ensuring mortgages for suburban development while redlining urban neighborhoods, refusing loans in areas typically served by neighborhood groceries. This systematic disinvestment meant aging grocery store owners could neither sell their businesses to new operators nor secure loans for modernization. Automobile ownership skyrocketed from 25.8 million vehicles in 1945 to 61.7 million by 1960. This mobility changed consumer expectations. Families could now drive to larger stores offering more selection and lower prices, even if those stores were miles from home. The neighborhood advantage of proximity eroded in the face of automotive convenience. Meanwhile, television transformed advertising. Large chain stores could afford TV commercials reaching thousands of households simultaneously. Independent grocers relied on word of mouth and perhaps small ads in local papers. This created an unprecedented marketing imbalance. By 1956, the A&P supermarket chain was spending $8.5 million annually on advertising, more than the combined revenue of 200 average neighborhood groceries. Refrigeration technology continued advancing as well. By 1950, 80% of American homes had refrigerators, enabling weekly rather than daily shopping. Freezers became common in the 1950s, further extending the time between shopping trips and reducing the convenience advantage of nearby stores. The supermarket model expanded rapidly. In 1946, there were approximately 2,500 supermarkets in America. By 1960, there were over 19,000, capturing 70% of grocery sales. The economics were brutal for small operators. Supermarkets could purchase in volumes that commanded discounts from suppliers, discounts unavailable to independent stores. The average supermarket in 1960 sold approximately $1.8 million in goods annually, compared to $100,000 for the typical neighborhood grocery. Behind these statistics were thousands of human stories of grocery owners facing impossible competition and difficult choices. In Cleveland, Yancey Jackson watched sales at his family grocery decline 15% in 1962 when a national tea supermarket opened a mile away. By 1965, revenue had fallen 40%. He extended his hours, working from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. 7 days a week. He eliminated his own salary, living off savings. When a customer's child needed emergency dental work, he still extended credit, though his own business was failing. By 1968, he had mortgaged his home to keep the store afloat. "I felt like I was abandoning my neighborhood," he recalled in a 1975 oral history. "These people depended on me. Mrs. Washington was 87. How would she get to the supermarket a mile away? Mr. Gaines had no car. the supermarket wouldn't extend credit when his disability check was late. Jackson finally closed in 1972 after 20 years in business. The building became a liquor store. Within 3 years, the 8-block radius around his former store had no fresh food retailer at all, the beginning of what would later be termed a food desert. This pattern repeated across America. Between 1958 and 1967, approximately 100,000 neighborhood groceries closed. The impact wasn't distributed equally. Urban neighborhoods, particularly those with predominantly Black, Hispanic, or elderly residents, were hit hardest. Rural communities too small to attract supermarket chains lost their only food retailers. What happened to the people who had run these stores? Some adapted. About 15% of former independent grocers joined cooperative buying groups like IGA, Independent Grocers Alliance, to gain purchasing power. Others specialized in niches supermarkets ignored: ethnic foods, specialty products, convenience items. Many simply retired, often with little to show for decades of work beyond the real estate they owned. Their children, who might have inherited these businesses, increasingly pursued other careers. College enrollment doubled between 1950 and 1970. The children of grocers became accountants, teachers, engineers, part of a professional class rather than small business owners. The generational continuity that had sustained many neighborhood groceries for decades dissolved. For employees of neighborhood groceries, the transition was mixed. Supermarkets offered more formalized employment, regular hours, benefits, sometimes union representation. But they eliminated many part-time positions that had provided supplemental income to neighbors and flexible work to mothers with young children. The informal job market that neighborhood groceries had supported, the high school student who made deliveries after school, the widow who worked mornings at the register, largely disappeared. For communities, the loss extended beyond food access. A study of Chicago neighborhoods in the 1970s found that areas that had lost their neighborhood groceries experienced a 23% decrease in voluntary community organization membership. The incidental social interactions that occurred daily in these spaces, what sociologists call weak ties, turned out to be crucial to community cohesion. Their absence was felt in unexpected ways. Some neighborhood groceries found unexpected second lives as predecessors of today's convenience stores. Unable to compete with supermarkets on selection and price, they pivoted to convenience, extended hours, prepared foods, small quantities for immediate consumption. This adaptation worked particularly well in dense urban areas where supermarkets couldn't secure large enough locations. Others transformed into specialty ethnic markets. As new waves of immigration came to America in the 1960s and 70s, from Cuba, Vietnam, Korea, and beyond, former neighborhood groceries often became cultural lifelines, providing familiar foods and social spaces for new communities. In 1975, approximately 40% of surviving independent groceries primarily served specific ethnic communities. The loss of neighborhood groceries created vacuums that larger retailers were slow to fill. By the mid-1970s, urban food deserts had emerged across America, areas where residents had no food retailer within walking distance. In Detroit, a 1977 study found that 67% of Black residents had to travel more than a mile to reach a supermarket, compared to 22% of white residents. The spatial distribution of food access had become a civil rights issue. Rural communities faced similar challenges. Between 1963 and 1978, approximately 30% of rural counties lost all grocery retailers, requiring residents to drive to neighboring counties for food shopping. This particularly impacted elderly rural residents without reliable transportation. The economics driving these changes were remorseless. Between 1954 and 1974, the average size of a food retail store tripled from 8,000 square feet to 24,000 square feet. Inventory expanded from approximately 2,000 items in the typical neighborhood grocery to over 15,000 in supermarkets. Operating costs as a percentage of revenue dropped from 20% in neighborhood stores to 13% in supermarkets. The economies of scale were undeniable. Yet something less tangible but equally important was being lost, a way of shopping that was also a way of belonging. In neighborhood groceries, shopping had been a social act performed in public, requiring interaction and negotiation. In supermarkets, it became a private act performed in public space, anonymous, efficient, and increasingly isolated. Some say the buildings that once housed neighborhood groceries retain memories of their former purpose. In Boston's North End, an apartment converted from a former Italian grocery reports unexplainable sounds of conversation around the kitchen, formerly the store's main counter, at times when no one is home. In San Francisco, a clothing boutique in a former corner grocery finds merchandise mysteriously rearranged in the morning, always in neat rows resembling produce displays. Are these simply urban legends? Most likely. But they speak to a deeper truth. The neighborhood grocery store represented something fundamental in American community life, something whose absence continues to haunt us. By 1980, the transformation was largely complete. Approximately 85% of America's grocery shopping occurred in chain supermarkets. The neighborhood grocery had become an endangered species, surviving primarily in dense urban neighborhoods, rural communities too small for supermarkets, and as ethnic specialty stores serving immigrant populations. The 1980s and 1990s brought new challenges even to these survivors. The rise of warehouse clubs like Costco, founded 1983, and Sam's Club 1983, created a new competitive pressure, bulk purchasing at deeply discounted prices. Walmart's expansion into groceries, accelerating after 1988, introduced a competitor with unprecedented purchasing power. Between 1990 and 2000, approximately 31% of remaining independent grocers closed. Delia Orenstein had operated Orenstein's Grocery in Chicago's Rogers Park neighborhood since 1958. By 1992, at age 72, she was one of the last traditional neighborhood grocers in the area. Her store, once bustling with customers, now saw perhaps 30 people on a good day. Her son Michael, an accountant, reviewed her books quarterly. "Mom, you're losing money," he told her in the spring of 1993. "Last quarter you took in $32,000, but spent $36,000 on inventory and utilities. You haven't paid yourself in 3 months." "Messes." "Kaplan can't get to the Jewel," she replied, referring to an elderly customer. "The Diaz family needs credit when Mr. Diaz's construction work slows in winter. Who will take care of them?" She kept the store open until 1997, subsidizing it with her Social Security checks and savings. When she finally closed, she continued informally shopping for 8 elderly customers, delivering groceries from the Jewel supermarket to their homes weekly, a ghost of the service her store had once provided to the entire neighborhood. This pattern of neighborhood grocers continuing to serve their communities even as their businesses failed appears repeatedly in oral histories. The social bonds formed over decades of daily interaction didn't dissolve easily, even when the economic relationships ended. The final wave of closures came with the rise of online grocery shopping in the 2000s and 2010s. While e-commerce initially had limited impact on food retail, services like Instacart, founded 2012, and Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods in 2017 accelerated the trend. By 2020, approximately 10% of grocery shopping occurred online, creating yet another competitive pressure on surviving neighborhood stores. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2022-021 delivered the final blow to many remaining neighborhood groceries. While food retail overall saw increased sales as restaurants closed, the benefits flowed primarily to larger chains and online services. Approximately 3,500 independent groceries closed permanently during this period, roughly 16% of those still operating before the pandemic. What remains today of America's neighborhood groceries? Physically, their buildings endure, repurposed as restaurants, boutiques, offices, or residences. In Chicago, approximately 40% of buildings that housed neighborhood groceries in 1950 still stand, though less than 3% still function as food retailers. Their distinctive architecture, large display windows, corner locations, residential space above, makes them recognizable to those who know what to look for. Culturally, their memory persists in literature, film, and oral histories. John Updike's short stories, Philip Roth's novels, and countless memoirs capture the central role these spaces played in American community life. The neighborhood grocery appears in films from It's a Wonderful Life, 1946, to Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, 1989, often as a symbol of community cohesion or tension. Institutionally, a few remarkable survivors continue. In New York City, Albany's Meats and Poultry has operated continuously since 1923 in Manhattan's Little Italy. In New Orleans, Kensico's Market has served the city since 1958. These rare examples survive through a combination of real estate ownership, eliminating rent pressure, loyal customer bases, and adaptation to changing market conditions. Conceptually, the neighborhood grocery has found new expression in the 21st century through farmers' markets, community-supported agriculture, food co-ops, and bodega revival initiatives. Between 2000 and 2020, farmers' markets increased from 2,863 to 8,140 nationwide, driven largely by consumer desire for the personal connection and local focus that neighborhood groceries once provided. What was lost with the neighborhood grocery wasn't simply a retail format but a complex social institution. These stores had functioned as informal credit unions, community information centers, social welfare offices, cultural preservation societies, and public spaces where diverse community members interacted daily. Their disappearance left gaps that other institutions struggled to fill. The impact continues to reverberate. Studies show that neighborhoods with access to small, independent food retailers have higher levels of social cohesion, lower crime rates, and better health outcomes than comparable areas served only by large chain stores or with no food retailers at all. The food desert phenomenon, affecting approximately 19 million Americans in 2019, correlates strongly with the disappearance of neighborhood groceries. The economic consequences extended beyond food access. Neighborhood groceries had been crucial first rungs on the economic ladder for immigrants and marginalized communities. When they vanished, an accessible path to business ownership narrowed significantly. In 1960, approximately 21% of self-employed Americans worked in food retail. By 2010, that figure had dropped to 4%. What happened to America's neighborhood groceries? Some say it was simply market evolution, larger, more efficient models replacing smaller, less competitive ones. Others point to deliberate policy choices, highway construction, suburban subsidies, and urban disinvestment that disadvantaged the urban neighborhoods where these stores thrived. Still others see their decline as part of a broader transformation in American community life, from local and relationship-based to mobile and transaction-focused. The truth likely encompasses all these factors and more. The neighborhood grocery didn't disappear because it failed at its core mission. By measures of social function and community service, these establishments were remarkably successful. They vanished because the economic and cultural context that sustained them transformed fundamentally in the post-war era. Today, in certain repurposed grocery buildings, people report hearing unexpected sounds, the ding of old cash registers, the murmur of conversation when no one is present, the sliding of doors that no longer exist. Perhaps these are simply the creaks of aging structures or the power of suggestion in spaces rich with history. Or perhaps they reflect something deeper, the persistent echo of a way of life that emphasized connection over convenience, relationship over efficiency. In a corner building in Brooklyn, now divided into luxury apartments, the space that once housed Clayman's Grocery is occupied by a young couple who occasionally find their pantry items mysteriously rearranged overnight. Canned goods placed in neat rows, spices alphabetized. Old-timers in the neighborhood smile when they hear this story. That's just old man Kleinman, they say, still organizing his shelves. Whether literal ghost or metaphorical memory, the spirit of the neighborhood grocery lingers in America's consciousness. These stores represented something profound about community life, the belief that commerce could be personal, that economic relationships could also be social ones, that a neighborhood needed spaces where people of different backgrounds regularly encountered one another. So whatever happened to America's neighborhood grocery stores? Ask 10 people, get 10 answers. What's certain is that something valuable was lost in their passing, not just buildings or businesses, but a way of belonging. In their absence, we continue searching for new spaces and new institutions that might fulfill the same fundamental human need for connection through the daily acts of commerce. The bell above a grocery store door falls silent, but its echo continues to resonate through American community life, reminding us that how we obtain our daily bread matters not just economically, but socially, culturally, and perhaps even spiritually.